Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome to the Auckland Unitarian Church. Welcome especially to a number of visitors here today. I hope you will feel welcome here. I've been a member of this church for now about 3 years, and one of the reasons I kept coming back was because I felt so welcome more than I had in other places that I had worshipped. Like a lot of storytellers, I like to have a happy ending, but today I'm starting with some thoughts about people who feel that they don't belong. They include Maori, who feel misunderstood by Pākehā, and Pākehā who also feel that they don't belong. They include a Jewish woman in Auckland who felt that she didn't belong in New Zealand, but she found a way to cope. And a Danish man who was told that he was a misfit, but he ended up being very popular. Many of these stories today are about being Pākehā, but Pākehā or not, I hope you will feel welcome with us today. I'll be inviting people to comment on this later after the sermon, because I appreciate it's a controversial sermon that may well annoy some people, but I would appreciate your contributions as well as mine. And we invite you to join us with a cup of tea afterwards. Welcome. For our opening words, I'd like to say a story that Jesus told, which shows that sometimes there are two sides to loneliness. His story was about a younger son who left home and wasted his father's money and really cut himself off from his family. But eventually he came back to himself and realized he had done wrong and went to his family and asked his father for forgiveness. And he was forgiven. And the father held a welcoming party for him. But that only led to another disaster. It made the older brother feeling that this was unfair, and he refused to come to the party. And the father had to go out and try and patch up things with the older son. So when you try reconciliation, sometimes you end up messing it up with somebody else. You can't win, but I think you should try. I light this candle as a symbol of our shared journey together. I'd like to thank Sean Miller for inviting me to preach on the subject of Pākehā now. It was a prize that he won in the auction a few months ago, and I felt quite challenged by it. His topic was being Pākehā now. And this was a challenge for me because I have never called myself a Pākehā, but I had never asked myself why not. So it was a challenge to me to investigate something new and also to investigate my own attitude. Unfortunately, after studying it, I was surprised to find what a controversial issue it is, and to discover that Pākehā is still not a term I want to use, but I can understand why other people do. And so this sermon comes out branching outwards, because there are quite a lot of different views on this subject, and I want to start with the one that Michael did. In the words "being Pākehā now" are the title of a book by Michael King, written in 1999. And the book has a subtitle, "Reflections and Recollections of a White Native." So the writer regards himself as a Pākehā in the sense that he is a native of New Zealand, but a white one. And the guts of his conclusion is that New Zealanders of European descent have just as much right to live here and have their own culture as Maori do, which I heartily agree with. But he doesn't say this in opposition to Maori. His main work for many years was trying to understand Maori and their history and their values and their leaders. But he also is proud of his own values as a Catholic with an Irish background, and sharing, as the Irish did, and identification with the land. So this book is an autobiography featuring events which raised this awareness in himself, which he passed on to others. His life has so many twists and turns in it that I find it a hard thing to summarise, but some of his main turning points were when he went to university, he didn't know what career he wanted to do, but he got a BA in history, English, French, and political science, and he thought he would like to end up writing in some way, but he hadn't decided what kind of writing he would like to do. And he ended up doing several careers as a historian, but also as a journalist at the same time. His first job as a journalist was in 1968, when he got a job with the Waikato Times. Up till then, he had not been particularly well-versed in Maori issues, but he was given the Maori round, and so every week he had to write stories about Maori. And he spent a large number of his weekends attending hui and tangi, and he said he was immediately aware of his own huge gaps in knowledge of the Maori language and of Maori generally. The proceedings that he was attending every week were entirely in Maori, and he couldn't understand a word without someone alongside to translate. And the speeches and conversation were full of references to people and events that he didn't know anything about. Well, he very quickly started to fill in these gaps. He brought a tribal history of Tainui, the iwi of his area. He also enrolled in Maori language classes, and he joined the Waikato Historical and Archaeological Societies. At one large tangi, he met Eva Rickard, a well-known Maori protest leader, and two other leaders who took him under their wing, and they introduced him to Maori leaders, including one woman with personal experience dating back to the Waikato War in the 19th century. And she, when he met her, was still dressed in 19th century clothing, smoking a pipe, looking very much like Maori did in the 19th century. She had a moko, the Maori traditional tattooing down her chin for women, but it was a tradition that was dying out, and he wondered why this was, and he thought that this was a part of Maori culture which was in danger of disappearing. And so he set out to meet every woman who had one. He found 70 of them and interviewed all of them. In 1971, he reappraised what he is doing. He had been promoted to a leader writer and acting news editor, and he wrote editorials about Vietnam and sporting contact with South Africa. But he said few people read them, and some of his colleagues criticised him for being too political and too one-sided. They said journalists are supposed to be neutral. And he comments on this. He said he now questioned the ability of New Zealand institutions, based on British and Western models and cultural assumptions, to deal fairly with people whose values and lifestyle were not Maori. So he was becoming very critical of Pākehā. A large part of the rest of his book is about his efforts to tell Maori stories that Pākehā were not aware of. They include a TV series and a number of books. Some of these Maoris were not keen to have their stories written, so a big part of his job was negotiating to get the consent of the people involved. And he obviously did this very well indeed, and is praised by many Maori for what he was doing it. But despite doing this, he later got criticised by other Maori for doing things which they said Maori should be doing themselves. So there was a no-win side to his story. He also wrote a history of New Zealand. He and Guy Salmon made submissions to Parliament about a race relations bill, which led to the Office of Race Relations Conciliator being set up. And in part of the speech that they made to Parliament was, "We reject both the concepts of assimilation, implying an absorption of minority cultures by the majority one, but we also reject integration, implying a combination of values of one or more cultures. We prefer the concept of multiculturalism, whereby cultures are encouraged to exist alongside one another, retaining their differences and respecting one another. And he said in New Zealand, this means in particular retaining relationships between Maori and Pākehā cultures. Among the consequences, he said, was a need to build up the base of minority cultures, especially Māoritanga, and to reduce an overbearing influence on the part of the majority culture. Now, I think this is a remarkable story and a remarkable achievement. Another turning point in his thinking, though, was when he made his first visit back to Britain. His forebears came from Ireland and from Scotland, I think it was, but he mostly refers to his Irish background. He hadn't felt any need to have an OE experience like many New Zealanders did. He visited many places, but he did this very much later in life. He visited places from his own Irish background, but he was surprised that this trip made him more, not less, a New Zealander. He missed the empty land of New Zealand bird song, the common perspective between Maori and Pākehā. He was shocked at the racial prejudice he met in Britain at times. He resented the way some Europeans ignored him and others patronised him. These are people who felt that Europe was the centre of the universe and what happened in little New Zealand was of little consequence. And this strengthened his conviction that New Zealanders, for all their faults, had virtues that were precious, an unwillingness to be intimidated by new things, their opposition to the class system, their compassion for the underdog, a sense of responsibility to people in difficulty, and a lesser degree of racial prejudice. But a key part of his book was that there had been a huge change in Maori issues between the 1970s and mid-1980s. He wrote a book first about being Pākehā in 1985, when he said this kind of thing about the work that he was doing. But by 1999, there had been a Maori Renaissance, and Maori were, in fact, speaking up for themselves. And so he realised he had to update it, and hence the title of his second book, Being Pākehā Now, because of the change in New Zealand since then. Most of them changes that he favoured. For instance, he said that Maori radicals were saying that Pākehā historians had neglected Maori. He began by saying in 1971, getting my times wrong. When he wrote in 1971, he was saying that Pākehā historians had neglected Maori history and should not. But later, when he wrote, after he wrote his two books, he felt the argument was no longer that Pākehā historians should take notice, it was that they should leave it alone and let Maori do it. One example was Sid Jackson, who he met in 1978. Jackson said it was an unforgivable bungle by Waikato Maori that they let King write a Maori biography. He got even more criticism when he was hired to help write 12 chapters about major Maori districts. He didn't want to do it. He suggested there should be consultation and a Maori scholar should chair it, but no scholar was forthcoming. So against his better judgment, he did it himself. He was an editor, but in a facilitator way. But several iwi said he should not be doing it at all. Tūhoi wanted nothing to do with it if he was the editor. There was a similar reaction when he wrote a biography of Whina Kuba. Critics said that she was more popular among Pākehā than Maori and regarded her as an inappropriate person to be given that kind of treatment. So he decided to stop this kind of writing, but continue to be a mentor for Maori writers. And over the same period, many changes happened which he approved of strongly. Maori were getting a stronger sense of identity. It was being encouraged by the government and others. More urban marae were being built, so there was less danger of Maori who went to cities losing their culture. Kahanga reo were becoming more popular, making it less likely that Maori would lose their language and their culture. And from the late 1980s, perhaps one of the most important changes, the Waitangi Tribunal was addressing past injustices against Maori. There were also changes to the public service. I was in the public service over part of this time, and it was amazing the emphasis that was being built on to Maori culture. Speaking from my own experience now, there were changes to the law to enable Maori culture to be considered in the justice system, and there were in sentence there were ways that people who were being sentenced would be referred to Maori support. There was a more of a rehabilitative justice where people negotiated with the iwi and other people affected. So the whole public service was showing more signs of accommodating Maori perspectives and encouraging respect from them. So his conclusion was, he said it's important to complete the program of Waitangi Treaty settlements, but apart from that, he says he no longer believes in the inevitability or even the desirability of a bicultural nation. This model, he said, served Maori well when there were injustices to fight and imbalances to correct. But now he doubts that most Maori, or most Pākehā, want to define themselves in simple biculturalism. I must admit that rather surprised me, because many people who I know who share his concern for Maori perspectives would still say that biculturalism is part of what they are working for. Well, I found the story quite inspiring, but there was a gap in it for me. Although he tells a lot of stories, he does not spend a lot of time forming the conclusions. For instance, he himself clearly identified as a Pākehā, and he understood Pākehā to mean someone who has a right to live in New Zealand, is indigenous in the same sense as Maori. To me, the word indigenous doesn't mean somebody whose family arrived here 150 years ago. It goes way further back than that, but that is not the main issue. But to me, he had not looked at the alternatives. Because it was an autobiography, naturally he spoke of his perspective of being a Pākehā. He didn't look at why some Pākehā do not want to be called that. I filled in some of these gaps with a Wikipedia article on Pākehā. And it says it is a Maori term for New Zealanders of European descent, but it says a lot of New Zealanders object to being named in a language of their own. A university study in 2013 found that only 12% chose the term Pākehā, 53% preferred to call themselves New Zealanders, and 17% preferred to call themselves Kiwi. In the 1986 census, there was people could record themselves as Pākehā for the first time. 36,000 people ignored the ethnicities and wrote down New Zealanders, or ignored the question completely. So in 1996, the census wording was changed to New Zealand, European or Pākehā, but again there were a lot of adverse reactions. And so in the census we had last week, it simply goes back to saying, giving people the choice of New Zealand, European. But it also, the Wikipedia article also refers to people with views similar to Michael King. It said it's a term used by New Zealanders of European ancestry in distinction to the Maori term Te Iwi. Sometimes when this subject comes up, people talk of a Maori perspective and a Te Iwi perspective. And coming from the Methodist Church, that is what they do. They have divided their church into two halves, a Maori half and a Te Iwi half. The Te Iwi includes Pākehā, but it also includes Polynesian people and other ethnic groups. But the term Te Iwi means a visitor or foreigner, in contrast to the tangata whenua. So I and many others regard Te Iwi as a very negative term. But anyway, that's the range that Wikipedia sees in the views in New Zealand. But that doesn't give us a clear alternative to what Michael King was saying. For that, I turned to actually a book edited by him. It's called Pākehā. He's got several books of very, very similar title, which is a little confusing. But Pākehā is an anthology of articles by Pākehā of how they see their role in New Zealand. And I found one of them in particular very interesting. It was a Jewish perspective by a woman called Leslie Max, who was made a dame for her work with disabled children. I had personal connections with her because I knew several of her family at school, and when she describes her background, it is part of my background, and ironically in Takapuna, and ironically Michael King also had part of his background in Takapuna. So Takapuna Beach features in lots of people's viewpoint. But although Leslie Max is in a book about Pākehā, she never mentions that word at all in her whole article. But she describes herself as having two strands to her life, being a New Zealander and being a Jew. And she said there are a number of painful differences between the two. For instance, when she was about 6 or 7, she recalls two of her friends saying, "You're a Roman Catholic, aren't you?" And she didn't know. And so she said, "Yes, I am." But her parents were not dedicated Jews, so she didn't realise that they were Jewish. Well, she hadn't worked it through. But she thought there was something quite different about her. Another question, when she did discover she was a Jew, was, what are you then, a Jew first or a New Zealander first? And she found that a very painful question. And somebody said to her, "Why don't you Jews just go back to Jerusalem or wherever you come from?" Others said, "You've got to realise New Zealand is a Pacific country. It's not attached to Europe anymore." Words a bit similar to what Michael King says. But her conclusion, after 4.5 decades in New Zealand, is that she can live with it. She can live with a certain fragmentation. She can live with having two identities. She said, "I don't need to satisfy other people's need for certainty or others' desires to pigeonhole me. Indeed, I have a sense of enrichment from this many-layered, many-faceted identity that is still in process of evolution." I won't go into the detail of all her experiences, but they include the fact that she was not aware of being Jewish, but she became aware. And when she became aware, she was proud of being a Jew, and she got encouragement from identity of a race of people who trace their ancestry back to being slaves in Egypt and being liberated. And that gave her a sense of identity in New Zealand. And she also became growingly aware of the appalling treatment of her own family members in Europe. And she said, "My identity as a New Zealander was modified by my knowledge that German, Dutch, Czech, Austrian and Polish authorities put Jewish, German, Dutch, Czech, Austrian and Polish children into trains bound for Europe for extermination camps. And the only reason she did not end up in an extermination camp herself was that her grandparents left Latvia before this happened." And when she came to New Zealand, she also felt that New Zealand also was not very friendly to Jews. They did accept Jewish people, but only those who they felt would integrate into the New Zealand way of life. So she was under pressure not to be a Jew, even though New Zealand was a much friendlier country than the ones she's escaped from. So the question, she says, was always there, even though I never put into words. No matter how fervently I might sing "God defend New Zealand," would New Zealand, if the chips were down, defend me? And she asked herself, do people still hold these gloomy images of Jews? Yes, she said, here in Auckland, outside the synagogue in Grays Avenue, on the way from a kanaka party to Metro's Christmas party, I was standing with my small grandchildren, this is outside the synagogue, and was told, "We will get you all yet." She said, here in Auckland there have been serious threats against Jewish people that she cannot reveal, but they have been thoroughly validated, simply on the basis that they were Jewish. And she recalls a meeting in Auckland in 1981, when the police were being briefed on racism before the Springbok tour, and she was invited to be one of the speakers at this training session. And she said most of the police just sat quietly as she spoke, but some got stuck in and said, "You people, you get into this country, you claw your way up. What do you want to be different for? Why can't you just be New Zealanders like anyone else? Are you a New Zealander first or a Jew first?" And her answer is she doesn't need to rank her loyalties. She says, no one demands who do you love better, your parents or your children or your husband. It's only in totalitarian regimes that a single answer is required. And she says she doesn't want to be told she must cut her ties with Europe. They're still valuable to her. And she doesn't like the custom of keeping a quota that some New Zealanders do, of saying everything must have a New Zealand emphasis. She said, how many songs must we have about Canterbury sheep musterers? There are only so many songs that can be singing about New Zealand icons. And she can identify with the Maori, who also lost many of their storytellers who kept their knowledge alive after their country was swamped by newcomers. And she feels that she too is losing precious contact with Europe and her world that was deliberately destroyed. And she said the most wounding assault on Jewish identity she can recall is the new Anglican prayer book written in 1990. It's had all references to Jews and Zion deleted. And she said that there was a Jewish psalm which says, "By the waters of Babylon we sat down, we wept when we remembered Zion." Beautiful song. And she says, but Anglicans have edited the Judaism out of it. She concludes that identity is much more a matter of ethnicity. It's also a matter of values and worldview. And she said the worldview of the Jews when they're being persecuted in Europe were liberal social democrats. And she said liberal social democrats are also part of New Zealand, so which makes her feel that it is a good place to live in. And she said the equality in the law of prince and pauper, the need to protect the vulnerable, the foreigner, the widow, the orphan, the day labourer, that was articulated by the Jewish prophets. And she said that's a thing that enables her to feel at home in New Zealand because it supports those same values and became the world's first welfare state. So I found this a very thoughtful viewpoint, but in fact I could almost identify it more with Leslie Max's view, that I have different flavours to my identity. I have New Zealand aspects, I have Christian aspects, I now have Unitarian aspects, and I don't have to choose between them. I can have all of them. And I like very much your thought that each of us can choose our own identity, and it can be made up of many parts, and it can include people who see themselves as Pākehā, but it doesn't mean that we should all feel that way. In fact, my last hymn, which we'll have a bit later, says we must all do our own naming. And that is a feminist song, but I'm not quite sure what it means by naming, but I think it means that we don't have to accept labels that other people give us. We can pick our own, which may sometimes agree with others and sometimes may not. Well, quite a lot of food for thought, I hope. And I'd like to invite any of you who'd like to come forward and say how you see your identity in New Zealand.
Hello, my name's Shireen. First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for your sermon this morning. I was very lucky, fortunate enough to count Michael King as one of my friends. He and I shared a flat together in the 70s. He was the most delightful person, compassionate, caring, and with a wicked sense of humour and a wonderful storyteller. But one comment that I do want to make, I was thinking about language and thinking about our English language, and it's very polyglot. We've taken our language from so many cultures over the years, different traditions going back to the Norse and the ancient, many ancient cultures, in fact. I was born in the UK. I've still got a trace of an English accent, they tell me. But I've lived most of my life in New Zealand. I like to call myself Pākehā because I think it describes to me a sense of belonging to New Zealand, but also acknowledges and honours the influence I've had from Māori friends who have helped me understand my place in New Zealand. One of my greatest friends was Irihāpiti Ramsden. We met when we were 17. I didn't really understand what her world was like until she gave me a book by Patricia Grace, and she wrote on the inside cover, "Welcome to my New Zealand, Shireen." And it was very different to the experience that I had had growing up. And both Michael and Irihāpiti are dead, but they've had a huge influence on me and my life, and why I'm very proud to call myself Pākehā. So thank you for your talk this morning. I went down memory lane. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was the person who won the auction bid and nominated the topic for David. What's to say? Like Shireen, I'm very proud to be Pākehā. And I wasn't at all pleased that David, when I learned that he was going off in a different direction from the topic, he offered me a refund. As a donation to the church, a refund doesn't really fit. But I think the topic's still to be answered, and David, for whatever reason, decided to do a different topic, which was interesting and absolutely fascinating, but it wasn't the topic that I was hoping to hear about. Also, I want to acknowledge David for doing a tremendous amount of work. He was unfamiliar with the works of Michael King, as far as I'm aware, and bought numerous books and has done a lot of work on it, so full credit to David for that. But the topic, from my point of view, being Pākehā now, is still to be addressed.
Good morning, my name's Kurt, and usually when I'm travelling I call myself an Australasian because that really makes people think. I have a little story about what it means to be a New Zealander. I just applied a few weeks ago to teach at a knitting festival in Scotland, and they emailed me back and they said, "Are you based in the UK? Because we're only accepting teachers from the United Kingdom this year." And I said, "No, I live in New Zealand, I'm based in New Zealand, but we're a British colony and we have the Queen as our head of state, and what's more, we drink more tea per capita than the British, and we have more pipe bands per capita than Scotland." And they said yes, so they're flying me over to teach.
I have a really good friend who's a Māori woman and has been a leader in the Salvation Army for quite a few years, but we've been friends, I was about to say in spite of our differences, maybe because of our differences. And I took her with me to a home birth conference recently, and we were going around in a circle introducing ourselves, and I introduced myself before her, and then she introduced herself as Sharon's cultural and spiritual advisor. And I just loved it. So, I think we are sisters. And she also told someone else that she didn't think I was American or Kiwi or anything, that I was just a person of the world. And I, especially coming from her, I took that as a really big compliment. Yeah.
I was just thinking as I listened to your talk, I have often felt aware as I've grown up that there was kind of a gap for me about my ancestry, about my cultural roots, and growing up in New Zealand and then moving to Auckland when I was in my teens, and the very strong Pasifika and Māori cultural colour in Auckland, very strong, made me even more aware of that absence in my own familial sort of cultural knowledge of where I've come from. I mean, all I know is that some time ago, half came from Ireland and half from Scotland, and that's it. And there's been no feeding, no nurturing, no growth in that background for me. So I suppose I've always grown up as a Pākehā, feeling absence and grief at my own lack of culture, and quite a bit of envy, although that's a sort of a greedy word, but quite a bit of admiration and sort of wow when I look at what Māori and Pacific nations have, there, and how it feeds people and makes them whole. So I think we're really blessed to have Pākehā as a title of choice.
Hi, I'm Vivian, and I'm a 5th or 6th generation Kiwi. My people came here in 1821. And you struck a chord with me, Kate. I was always incredibly envious of my Maori friends. I went to schools with a high percentage of Maori, and they seemed to be more... I couldn't describe it as a child. I just had this envy that they seemed to have a culture, and they were more grounded, and I had no culture. That's how I felt. Until I was 40, I went back, my parents used to say. I went to Britain for the first time. And oh my God, I have a culture. I went to Britain and I felt it. I just looked around me and I talked to people and I felt. And from then on, I feel very, very comfortable here as a New Zealander, a Pākehā, and I know where my pathway came from.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. And, sorry.
When I filled out the census, and they wanted me to, they were obviously thinking someone like me would sign it, European origin. Well, as an American who wants to forget that he's an American under Trump, when I came here, it was Bush. I still wanted to forget I was an American. So I found the identity as Pākehā is very welcoming and a whole new label that didn't reveal my culture.
Like Viv, I felt going back to Britain was a liberating experience because I felt like a lot of things I had valued myself, like science and other things which were not taught in my school, and to go back to where my ancestors came from, it was a liberating experience because I identified with so many things that they did, and although I didn't agree with what they did, things like when Europe formed a community, I was proud of them. I felt all these people who've been enemies in my history books are making it up, and I felt good visiting all those countries. But on the other hand, when I read the British census, looking at the makeup of people there, they don't include European in their census questions. They include whites, black British people, Asian, British. Anyway, I would have classed as a white, which to me was not a thing I would like to be called, and so it was quite strange to find that that other countries such as France don't regard it as against human rights even to ask those questions. So they don't ask people what their ethnic background is at all. So
I think looking online, you might have heard about the Loving couple, biracial couple who married surname of Loving, and they've made it into a film, which will be really interesting. But if you Google it, there's been an ongoing kind of series of documentaries made about the Loving generation, and so it interviews lots of people who have mixed parentage, and it's all about who are they able to belong to, and for many, of course, we'll be aware they often feel like they don't belong in either camp, and it comes down to choice, who do they choose to belong to. But something that fascinated me, thinking about censuses and what do people put down as their, makeup, and, 50, 60, 70 years ago in the States, people had to say if they were not just biracial, but, and I'm not going to get the names right, but quarter racial, eighth racial, you had to really sort of break it down, how much of the tar brush had entered into your pure race, extraordinary.
thank you.
I realised we were running over time, but I did pay $25 for this topic. My name, Sean Miller, just as a case of identity. I just want two things. Just want to talk about Sean Miller for a moment. If any of you are familiar with Irish history, you know that name doesn't work at all. And if you Google us, there's very few Sean Millers in the world. Because Sean is a Catholic name in Northern Ireland, which is my paternal heritage, and Miller is a Protestant name, and the two absolutely do not go together. And there wouldn't be a single Sean Miller in Ireland. There's a few ignorant people who have named their children Sean Miller, but very few, and in my case it was quite deliberate. My father was obviously of Protestant stock. He came here as a child at the age of 7. He rejected the church, became an atheist, and supported the nationalist cause. And my mother came from a family of left-wing communists and atheists, and they agreed together to call me Sean to thin the nose at the Protestant community in Northern Ireland, which is what I'm descended from. So for me, I identify as atheist and now to some extent Unitarian. And it's these things, they're all a blend. And if you go back in one's ancestry, there's all sorts of mixtures. My mother's side, I've got Irish Catholic. So it's I think it's more what you feel. And to me, as people have talked about going back to Britain, I went to Britain. I've lived in Britain twice, in England. I've lived in England twice. And I suppose one of the reasons that really strengthened my Pākehā identity is that, yes, you go back there, and if you're of a British European origin like myself, there's lots of things that feel common. But by crikey, if you spend any time living there, actually as a resident in Britain, you realise there's a lot of differences as well. It's not just that New Zealand Pākehā identity has moved on, and it's not the same thing as the various identities that exist in Britain. So that's how, one of the reasons I've become so strongly identified as Pākehā.
Thank you.